The film Sound of Freedom is an emotionally intense thriller that tackles the harrowing issue of human trafficking, specifically the exploitation of children. While the movie deals with an incredibly dark and sensitive subject matter, it does not rely on explicit graphic scenes to convey the horror it portrays. Instead, it uses suggestion, subtlety, and emotional tension to create a sense of unease and discomfort, proving that true horror does not always need to be explicitly shown on screen. The disturbing nature of Sound of Freedom stems from its exploration of real-world trauma and the psychological devastation it causes, rather than relying on shock value or graphic depictions of abuse. One of the most compelling aspects of Sound of Freedom is the way it portrays the horrors of child trafficking without resorting to explicit or graphic imagery. The film does not linger on disturbing scenes of abuse or exploitation. Instead, it focuses on the emotional and psychological toll of such crimes, particularly on the victims and the individuals who are trying to rescue them. The horror in Sound of Freedom is more about what is implied than what is shown. The viewer's imaginations are left to fill in the gaps, and this often results in a far more disturbing experience than if the filmmakers had opted for graphic depictions of violence. In many ways, the absence of explicit scenes makes the film more haunting. The terror of child trafficking is not confined to a single moment or image, but is instead understood in the broader context of the trauma it leaves behind. The psychological horror of what happens to these children and the emotional devastation experienced by the characters who try to save them are far more unsettling than any explicit visual could convey. The film focuses on the lengths to which the traffickers will go, the way they manipulate and dehumanize their victims, and the systemic indifference that allows such atrocities to continue. This deeper, more abstract horror is what makes Sound of Freedom so profoundly disturbing. The true horror of Sound of Freedom also lies in the emotional weight of the injustice that is unfolding on screen. While there are no graphic depictions of the trafficking or abuse, the film draws viewers into a world where these acts are a grim reality. The helplessness of the victims and the frustration of the rescuers are felt deeply through the performances and the pacing of the film. The portrayal of Tim Ballard, a former Homeland Security agent who becomes a real-life crusader for the rescue of children from sex trafficking, is powerful because it captures not just the action, but the emotional burden of confronting such atrocities. His stoic but deeply empathetic performance allows the audience to feel the weight of his character's mission without the need for overt violence or disturbing imagery. The emotional disturbance comes from the knowledge that these events are not merely fictional. The film is based on real-life stories, and the horrors depicted in Sound of Freedom happen in the real world every day. This connection to reality amplifies the sense of dread and makes it much harder to ignore or dismiss the subject matter. By focusing on the human cost of these crimes and the emotional and psychological devastation they cause, the film forces the audience to confront the uncomfortable reality that such events are happening all around us, often hidden in plain sight. Another key element in creating the disturbing atmosphere of Sound of Freedom is the use of suggestion. Rather than showing the worst moments explicitly, the filmmakers rely on dialogue, sound design, and subtle visual cues to suggest the horrors at hand. This method of storytelling allows the audience to infer the most disturbing elements, creating a psychological unease that lingers long after the movie ends. The suggestion of violence, exploitation, and suffering becomes much more powerful than explicit depictions because it taps into the viewer's fear of the unknown and the unknowable. For example, the film often focuses on moments of silence or subtle background details that signal danger or the presence of evil. The unsettling feeling in Sound of Freedom often comes not from a shocking event, but from the anticipation of what might happen next. This technique increases the tension and creates a constant feeling of discomfort. The camera lingers on faces, capturing fleeting expressions of fear or anxiety, allowing the audience to fill in the gaps with their own imagination. The power of suggestion in the film invites the viewer to confront the trauma and horror from an emotional, rather than purely visual standpoint. Perhaps the most significant aspect of the movie's subtle horror is its ability to provoke moral and psychological reflection. The trauma that trafficked children experience is not just physical, but emotional, psychological, and moral. By omitting explicit scenes of abuse, the film forces the audience to engage with the ethical implications of the story. What is truly horrifying is the realization that such exploitation exists, and that it is so entrenched and widespread that it can feel almost insurmountable. The film does not need to show abuse to make its point. Instead, it focuses on the moral horror of a world where such injustice is allowed to persist. The psychological impact of child trafficking is also made evident through the performances of the actors, whose characters undergo emotional and psychological struggles as they attempt to save the children. The anguish of the rescuers is palpable, and the toll that such an emotionally draining mission takes on them is a central theme in the film. The horror of Sound of Freedom does not come solely from the violence committed by traffickers, but from the deep emotional scars left on everyone involved, from the victims to the rescuers to the viewers themselves. In Sound of Freedom, true horror is not about graphic depictions of violence or exploitation. It is found in the discomforting silence, the emotional weight of the story, and the implication that these horrors happen in the real world every day. The absence of explicit scenes allows the audience to imagine the unimaginable, making the horror even more disturbing. By focusing on the psychological and emotional toll of human trafficking, Sound of Freedom achieves a level of unease that is far more impactful than any overt display of violence could ever be. The film's true horror lies not in what is shown, but in what is felt, understood, and implied.